Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming along to this webinar. I'm Corey Gibson from the University of Glasgow. I'm here representing not just Scottish literature at Glasgow, but this CIVIS network. CIVIS is like a European partnership universities, and we have begun a new network with a focus on contemporary Scottish literature. Myself at Glasgow, Hedon at Marseille, and Kirsten Stirling at Lausanne. And we have, this is our second webinar. We had one in the autumn last year on Alistair Gray's Poor Things. And today we're here to talk about IndyRef and Scottish literature. So the whole idea of the network is to keep researchers in touch with one another across Europe and further afield. Of course, folk are welcome. But we had a special kind of focus on trying to involve and include early career researchers, especially as they can sometimes be dispersed in institutions that maybe don't have as high a concentration of sort of scholars in the field as other places do. And so we thought this would be a nice way for folk to get involved. We wanted to keep it accessible, and so these sessions are just 1 hour. We'll be wrapping up at 6 o'clock UK time in an hour's time. And yeah, the idea of timing it now as well as so that it's at least early afternoon or early evening, late afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are in a European context at least. So that's the rationale. The plan today is we are going to have, on that note of emphasizing the work of early career researchers, we have 3 colleagues here today as our speakers. Maike Dinger from the University of Bournemouth, Calum Esler from Stirling, and Gina Lyle from York. I'll introduce you guys in your papers one by one as we go, but our speakers will each give a paper of about 10 minutes, or just present some sort of findings or pose some questions for about 10 minutes. We'll do those back to back and then reserve a bit of time at the very end for a discussion, for a bit of a Q&A for this digital roundtable. So that's the plan. The theme for the roundtable came out of some sessions at the recent, last summer, the Nottingham World Congress of Scottish Literatures put on by the IASL. And there were particular panels and discussions around devolution and post-devolutionary kind of periodization, around the question of IndyRef 10 years later as well. The rationale behind the discussion today is sort of to look back at these ideas about periodization organized around constitutional referenda, to ask about the sort of usefulness of that as a mechanism, and to go through that to open up broader questions about the discipline and periodization in general terms. So, you know, landmark dates are 1979, 1997, 1999 with the devolved parliament, 2014. So we're asking about whether there are literary texts that kind of anticipated 2014 in some ways, how literary culture responded in real time. We're going to ask whether or not IndyRef has any lasting sort of legacy in our field. Is it too soon to tell? Was the referendum kind of, or has it been memorialized in some ways by our literary culture, or has it been, what do they call it, memory hold, completely forgotten? This is in the context, of course, of recent scholarship like the EUP title from 2022, edited by Marie and Camille Manfredi and Scott Hames, Scottish Writing After Devolution. And that set out a whole host of opinions that tended to kind of move away, out from underneath some of the conventions of the national paradigm in this period. So we're asking questions about how these things have perhaps moved on from the ways in which literary historians tend to understand the 1980s and 90s, for instance. From my experience at the World Congress last year and from speaking to colleagues, I understand that some of the response to these kinds of questions around the national paradigm and the post-evolutionary period and IndyRef was coloured by kind of disillusionment to some degree, some feelings that the confluence of cultural and political energy that went into the referendum became a kind of damp squib. The question of how much hindsight can we actually seem to be able to apply to that historical moment, and of course the question of how that event, how the run up to it and the fallout after it revealed all sorts of kind of wobbly assumptions about the relationship between politics and culture, and which is, you know, upstream from the other, if you like. And I think this is so in their fundamental nature, loads of these debates have been going on for a really long time in our field, but they were given a particular shape and a kind of urgency during this period that I think is worth our examining. And I mean, it flares up again in different guises, especially through this mode of cultural politics and institutions. Most recently, I've been involved a wee bit in some of the new set texts for the Scottish Qualifications Authority. So high school students across Scotland and the Scottish texts that they are asked to study. Now, the revised text brought on a kind of more diverse reading list, and that has brought lots of really exclusionary kind of visions of Scottish literature and what it means to, the Scottishness of Scottish literature, what it means to try to establish that in the 21st century. A lot of that sort of stuff that the discipline has kind of moved past has come out of the woodwork in the context of that public discourse. But for the purposes of today, we're not necessarily going direct these big broad questions about the degree to which Scottish literature ought to be Scottish, but going back to specific texts that are in one way or another, explicitly or implicitly, kind of oriented towards the independence referendum of 2014. So that's the premise today. I'm gonna now hand over, I think we can kick off now with our first speaker, which is Maike Dinger. I don't know if you have the access you need, Maike, there to put up any slides you might have. So here's Maike's title is Vote for Us Deploying Strategic References to Braveheart, the Politics of IndyRef Literature. And before I prattle on any further, I'll hand over so that we can get started. Oh, it seems to have really zoomed in. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, sorry. Not sure why that happened. Yeah, thank you very much, Corey, for that really comprehensive introduction. 10 minutes aren't very long, but I'll try to give a bit of an input, a bit of an overview of some of the things that I've been working on. So I want to speak a little bit about the representations and absences of the political in recent Scottish writing and debate. And on these grounds, think about whether the referendum is a helpful benchmark for literary imagination and production, especially since little seems to have changed politically. One of the key questions then is maybe where the continued sort of like constitutional challenges leave Scottish literature and critical discourse. And some of that comes from the emphasis on sort of like literary involvement and in politics, that draws on self-perceptions in Scottish literature among Scottish writers, specifically in the context of cultural devolution, some of the things that Corey has already mentioned, specifically the idea that Scottish writers were essential in bringing about political change in the form of devolution. And literature has been emphasized as a marker of Scottish difference through the devolution period, and since, from sort of like national literary symbols and poetry performed at the opening of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, to the public office of the Scottish national poet. And this connection has been, or this connection between Scottish politics and literature has been further sort of like promoted by the Scottish government under SNP leadership and has been carefully curated by specifically former First Ministers Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon in the context of sort of like these constitutional changes. It will be interesting to see where this goes, but sort of like that's some of the context that especially the referendum is embedded in. And this sort of like perceived affiliation also found expression in the idea that Scottish writers would fulfill a key function in mobilising for Scottish independence. And a lot can be said about sort of like the rhetoric and even the mobilising role or power that Scottish writers and poets adopted in the public and media discourse at the time of the referendum. What such public prominence has meant for literary production itself is a different question, I would say. and a question about the political nature of contemporary, or more specifically IndyRef literature, and sort of like one of the key questions that I want to talk about a little bit more. So the referendum is an interesting case in as far as it not only made political but also various cultural statements. And one of these statements was its emphasis on civic nationalism and a progressive politics. And this sort of like emphasis ties in with evaluations of and claims by writers, but also by critics of Scottish literature that have tested recent or contemporary Scottish literature and increasingly depoliticized and transnational rather than strictly national or nationalist appeal, often also framed as a sign of a self-confident or mature nation. But if we look at how IndyRef literature, specifically novels, directly responded or engaged with the referendum, some of these qualities are notably absent, I would suggest. So for the purpose of this talk, I will focus on the following 3 novels addressing the referendum. That's Greg Smith's The Mile from 2013 on the right, James Robertson's To Be Continued from 2016, and Alan Cameron's Cynico from 2017. They all were published in response to, and often even during or just after the Scottish independence referendum, and directly engage with it. So they directly talk about it and use it as the context for the story. They are also comparable in various other ways, including their depiction of gender, connections to newspaper industry and the media, and their organization around journeys, which became itself a key trope of the referendum debate and discourse. And I'm sure many of you will remember the notorious sort of like no to yes, or sometimes even yes to no journeys, which featured everywhere in the media and also probably in some personal discussions. And in addition to that, it was also worth noting that noting that all of them are on the pro-independent side, and that's something that seems to be quite common or dominant in novels responding to the referendum. So there's very few sort of like that hold a pro-union side or perspective. All 3 novels wrestle with the tensions of sort of like trying to capture an authentic experience as well as something more than that, namely producing a statement on the state of the nation and the implications of a substantial political decision. And as such, these approaches do not only demonstrate attempts at capturing a political event, popularly described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They also sort of like try to capture these experiences and move away from political agency in terms of how they frame it, how they use different tropes. And one of these is also a preoccupation with voice, which in a referendum and in a vote obviously makes sense to talk about voices and things like that. But what we can see from how these novels work, the use of voice mainly reverts back to sort of like what Scott Hames calls a representative token. So he talks about this in the context of devolution literature, but I think it's very prominent in this part of IndyRef literature, at least, where the official campaign tried to prioritize a largely civic approach. The use of vernacular language in this kind of IndyRef fiction largely fulfills sort of like a nationalist or ideological role. So it's not concerned about or with giving voice or representing voice, but with representing nation. And that's something that you can see here a little bit in how the vernacular, how sort of like dialect is used in this excerpt from Cynico, but that's also something that is prominent in The Mile and To Be Continued, where sort of like vernacular language fulfills social function as the language of alcohol-induced banter and debate. And here it's used as a marker of othering and unreliability, because the text is supposed to be a translation from Italian. So using vernacular voices is quite an interesting step. And the narrative voice also comments on that, which makes it even more confusing and sort of like multi-layered. But it seems to typify the characters and places the novel in the context of a national belonging. It's sort of like voice then, or dialect, or the vernacular is more of a marker of difference, of place, of class, and lacks the political quality of empowerment or agency that voice sometimes implies. And in terms of modes of typifying or narrating Scotland and Scottish difference, this also finds expression in a preoccupation with nationalist stereotype associated with specific emblematic characters in these novels. For example, the 100-year-old poet and former politician Rosalind Manlochi in To Be Continued, who's portrayed as, quote, the mother of the nation. She constitutes sort of like a character symbol and representative of Scottish culture and the nation, much like Jock in the Mile, who is sort of like an elderly veteran, an emblem of Scottishness by name, appearance. He wears tartan sort of like trousers, and also the way he believes in terms of whiskey consumption, military sacrifices, all of these kind of things. So he sort of like represents the tourist version of Scottishness on sale while sort of like touring the Edinburgh Mile through sort of like in the context of a pub crawl. And Manlochi sort of like fits the image of the artists and writers cast as the political vanguard or popular leaders established in the myth of sort of like cultural devolution. Neither of these characters or another allegorical representation of pro-independence campaigner Marion as a freedom fighter who, quote, leaps to the barricades in Cynico, work within the civic narrative of progressive, civic, egalitarian pro-independence politics. So this shows that IndyRef literature sort of like focuses on sort of like more established tropes and themes around nationhood, about national identity, and even if sometimes self-ironic or self-critical. For example, the protagonist in To Be Continued, Douglas Finton Elder, is initially opposed to the, quote, prolonged bout of navel-gazing, but when his editor sort of like suggests that this will be quite lucrative, he changes his mind. I'm sort of like trying to wrap up. There's another example in Scabby Queen. I'm not sure if Calum is talking about this a little bit more, but just to give you another sort of like snippet of quite specific representations of Scottishness, of sort of like essentializing Scottishness in various ways. To then conclude more or less with a statement by Jenny Lindsay, who says that a subject like the independence referendum is a hard subject to be creative about, actually, without being a wee bit twee, almost, because we got a lot of poetry of the past that is kind of talking about Scotland and the fizzles. So basically saying that especially sort of like an event, a political event that is all about communicating difference, about being a standalone nation, about being independent, about being different from England, maybe necessarily has to revert back to sort of like flags and symbols and short-written versions of Scottishness, because of what was sort of like thinking about some of these sort of like stereotypical notions of how difference can be communicated in a cultural or literary sense. So the preoccupation with national symbolism and stereotype seems to be much more prominent in some of these novels than sort of like other ideas around giving voice to people. So maybe this is indicative of a tendency to fictionalize the referendum through stereotype or stereotype Scottishness, which in many ways seems to confine and limit Scottish literary imagination and production rather than sort of like open it up. I'll stop there and pass on to Calum.
Thank you very much, Maike. Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to go back to back with the talk. So if you do have any questions or thoughts off the back of Maike's paper, please do keep a note of them, or you can chuck them in the chat or the Q&A already, and we will come back to them after we have heard from our other two speakers. So next we have Calum Esler, whose title is Hope and Possibility in IndyRef Fiction. Are you good to go, Calum? Do you have the power of sharing slides? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, hi. So today I'll be talking about hope and possibility in IndyRef fiction. In what I'm about to say, I'll be characterizing independence as a route to multiple possibilities and remaining in the Union as a stagnant maintenance of the status quo. That's obviously a false dichotomy, especially given what actually happened in the following decade, but I've got 10 minutes, so forgive a slight lack of nuance here. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Momus's The Book of Scotland's, Kirsten's Scabby Queen, and Frankie Boyle's Meantime, which means that using Scott Hames' terms, I'll be covering texts that fall into the category of fictions of IndyRef, which he writes are more distant and ironical, enjoying a degree of aesthetic autonomy from the arguments of 2014. And I think that plays into the way that they tangle with hope and despondency. So first, we've got the Book of Scotland's, in which Momus imagines 156 Scotlands of varying lengths and degrees of absurdity. In the introduction that he wrote for the 2018 reissue by Luath, Momus describes the book as something delirious and speculative, a sort of brainstorming about possible future Scotlands, which would emphasize our nation's protean elasticity. So I think you can see how this is a text that's emerging from that post-2007 moment where the possibility of an independence referendum is increasingly on the cards, and there's this sense that Scotland is something that's open to debate. I think that Momus's project in this text is probably best summed up by Scotland 12, the Scotland in which Scotland is an alternative editing table for reality, and its major political task consists of showing how precarious our so-called natural context is. With the Book of Scotland's, Momus is pushing the boat out and expanding the horizon of expectation regarding what Scotland could and should look like. And I think that that should part is really crucial too. Despite its chaotic absurdity in a lot of these Scotlands, Momus seems to be challenging readers to think hard about what is actually possible with independence. And I'd say that, like other fictions of IndyRef, I find that there's less interest in if Scotland should be an independent country and more in what Scotland should be an independent country for. So this is a text that's full of febrile energy, inspired by the moment of its conception, and hope manifests itself here in the explosion of possibilities for the future, and also just in a sense that alternative futures are something worth considering. And here I want to take a brief moment to mention another critical term, which I find useful for discussing these texts and the referendum more generally, unfinalizability. In the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, finalization is an effect of monologic discourses that seek to provide closed definitions of people, states, ideologies, texts, and so on. Morrison and Emerson write, the act of finalizing, defining, or accounting for another is described as a fundamental threat to the essence of selfhood, which lies in the ability to render untrue all finalizing definitions. As long as a person is alive, Bakhtin writes, they retain the power to make conditional all external definitions of themselves and are therefore non-coincident with themselves. I'd argue that IndyRef was an unfinalizing moment that made conditional previous definitions of what Scotland and the UK could be. And I think this is a characteristic that is shared by some texts responding to the event. The horizon expanding energy that I'm highlighting in the Book of Scotland's could also be described as an unfinalizing energy. But that was 2009. So what happens to this energy after all those alternatives represented by the possibility of independence are quashed in the wake of No's victory? Well, let's turn to Scabby Queen. Calling this novel IndyRef fiction feels reductive since the story covers 5 decades, but I think that that half-century time span is useful for contextualizing the referendum And it means that Innes's IndyRef sections have quite a different effect to other fictional representations of the referendum. There's an unfinalizing quality to the novel generally as a character study of the frequently non-coincident Cleo Campbell from a myriad of angles. But for time, I'm just going to focus on Adele, who's a nurse who's our point of view character for the main IndyRef chapter. Adele's ranger supporting husband engages with programs like Question Time, which Adele usually snapped at him to shut off because her jangled nerves couldn't take the shouting they all did, not after a 12-hour shift. However, throughout this chapter and throughout her experience of the referendum widens her expectations of what is possible and inspires her to become not only engaged with politics, but also active within it as a campaigner for independence. And specifically, I'd like to compare Adele with another character who comes up in the chapter, the woman who made up her mind. For those unfamiliar, this character comes from a Better Together advert where she laments that she knows how important this vote is, but there's only so many hours in the day. And ultimately, amid insert shots of domestic clutter and literal hand-wringing, it's thinking about the impact that her decision will have on her children's futures that pushes her to vote no. She says, they have to live with the decision I make. I suppose that's why all this uncertainty bothers me so much. So on the one hand, you have someone for whom uncertainty means danger, and on the other, you have someone for whom uncertainty means hope. One person who's pushed into passivity and another who's inspired to action. And though there's obviously a degree of despondency amongst the pro-independence characters in this chapter in the wake of their loss, the chapter does end on a somewhat hopeful note. By chance, Adele is on shift when Cleo is brought in after a failed suicide attempt, and she says to the unconscious Cleo, "This wasn't your time, pal, not this time. When it is your time, you'll make it count, much more than this." Given that the novel's inciting incident is Cleo's successful suicide, and this chapter is immediately followed by her suicide note, there's a lot to unpack here, but for now, I think it's enough to say that Scabby Queen doesn't allow despair to dominate its post-2014 sections. I'd say that there is rather a sense that it's coming yet, a sense of Gramscian processuality that sees IndyRef not as this once-in-a-generation flash-in-the-pan moment, but part of a larger timeline that doesn't begin or end in 2014. As I mentioned earlier, I think that 50-year time span that the novel covers helps buoy this sense of processuality by not allowing the referendum to be a moment where we put all of our potential into one basket and then lose all alternative futures just because the referendum didn't end in independence. And there's a challenge here to that dichotomy that I set up at the start, where no doesn't have to mean nothing ever changes. But I think it's possible to get that sense of processuality in novels like Meantime that cover a shorter time span, in this case, about a month between January and February 2015. In Meantime, Boyle is exploring how the subversive spirit of the most radical sects of the pro-Indy camp is maintained in the aftermath of defeat, or indeed not maintained. But in this novel, hope is a double-edged sword that is just as often wielded in service of the politics of delay. There's a sense of perpetual postponement that forces beyond your control have permanently delayed the arrival of the future. Michael Gardner has written about delay as government as a means of maintaining the British status quo, which is conceived of as outside of history in a state of a priori permanence that cannot ever be challenged. Gardner writes, British civilization is in this sense a civilization of the queue, a suspension from a prior authority that makes a determining present impossible. But this is something that Boyle's protagonist sees in the pro-independence movement as well, as those who are still hopeful nonetheless seem reliant on a delayed gratification that he's cynical will ever actually be realized. One IndyRef campaigner that Boyle's protagonist encounters tells him nothing ends well, but in the meantime, we should try to stay optimistic. What's the alternative? Her hope is characterized by blue sky thinking with the absence of a solid plan that can be actualized. Again, though, it's through, I would say, recourse to processuality that Meantime snatches hope from the jaws of despair. The politics of delay focuses on singular events which can be anticipated and then be over and done with, rather than processes which are continuous. It relies on the idea that once a course has been chosen, it can never be altered. So I think I'll end with the same sentiment that Boyle's protagonist leaves us with, having found sobriety and, dare I say, hope. There's a certain amount of narcissism in thinking you can never change. You need to be a little egotistical to think that we're spinning through space and moving through time, yet you are somehow the one thing in the universe that's constant and unchangeable. It wouldn't be the first time that it's taken 2 referendums to change the landscape of Scottish politics. Thanks.
Grand, thank you so much, Calum. Again, just if anyone has any questions or notes, please keep a hold of them and pop them in the chat or the Q&A, or take a note and we can call on you to contribute afterwards in the Q&A. Okay, are you ready, Gina? Okay. So Gina's title is Borders, Brexit and IndyRef.
I've disoriented myself with my various screens. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. I'll be 30 seconds of panicking and then I'll be useful again. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much for such a kind introduction and lovely to follow those lovely papers. Hello, everyone. I'm indeed Gina, and today I'd like to suggest that our discussions around IndyRef and Scottish literature can be considered alongside literary representations of another mid-2010s national referendum, perhaps one regarding the UK's inclusion in the European Union. So today I'll very briefly introduce Brexit and its relationship with writing and how we can consider that alongside IndyRef literature. And I'll be using Ali Smith's seasonal quartet as a way of exploring this idea a bit further, paying particular attention to how borders and fences are employed and imagined in these conversations. So I feel we've all lived through this. The impact of Brexit as a cultural and political moment was felt very heavily in the fiction of the UK, with writers responding to the shift in a real range of ways. So much so that Christian Shaw coined the term Brexlit to very playfully, succinctly talk about writing that responds or alludes to Brexit and its consequences. It's something that a number of other critics have engaged with in a few different ways, and it has been incredibly popular as a concept. There's a lot of writing about this kind of approach to fiction, this kind of representation. You might also remember this graphic. One key thing to note for me in context of independence is that the Brexit voting results for us absolutely reinforced some of the concerns that were held by the Yes movement just 2 years on from IndyRef. Then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon voiced intentions in 2019 to prepare for a second referendum should Scotland be removed from the EU in light of this kind of majority Remain vote. So with this kind of concern linking the 2 referendums, we might expect that the literature of IndyRef writers would engage with Brexit. But I am quoting someone who's in this room. Ariana Antrona writes that Brexit is surprisingly absent from Scottish writing. She suggests that the reason for this silence is perhaps that Scottish writers are essentially not afforded the space to write about this issue because independence takes precedence. It's ultimately more vital. What I will say is there are writers that Ariana has noted who do engage with Brexit and also about Scottishness post-IndyRef, and one is Ali Smith, who claims both Scottishness and Englishness in her identity. In her seasonal quartet series, published between 2016 and 2020, Smith's particular goal was to really represent specific moments in time with very condensed publication processes. These were written and published very quickly so that they really represented what was happening in the state of the nation kind of thing. In doing so, Autumn is widely acknowledged as the first Brexit novel. It was on shelves just months after the referendum itself, and it captures something of that national mood. It also playfully hints at distinctions between Scottish and English voting practices and ways of living. As Smith's narration states, all across the country, people looked up Google. What is EU? All across the country, people looked up Google. Move to Scotland. One of the key images we get in Autumn, this very first Brexit novel, is one of a newly erected fence. 3 meters high, covered in barbed wire, cameras everywhere guarding a patch of no particular interest. With the novel so specifically documenting the anti-immigration xenophobia that was emboldened by the Leave campaign, the fence's role as segregating people, as dividing space, enclosing and protecting possessions is very, very overt. Ideas around borders and fences, physical and conceptual barriers to movement and connection aren't just used by Ali Smith to express what things were like at this moment. If I might move from A to Z, Zadie Smith's Brexit diary on Brexit also used this motif of offence as something to illuminate what that current moment was like. John Lanchester's 2019 book, The Wall, imagines a wall erected all around Britain, slightly emboldened by perhaps Trump's work on his, I've used the work very lightly there. These are representations of division that were resulting from the Brexit referendum. But to turn back to IndyRef, fences are also employed in some of the writing we're seeing there. It's a motif that's used by Alan Bissett in his contribution to Unstated, but this time with a slightly different angle. Rather than suggesting that fences are a result of the independence referendum, he says, these were put up in the 1980s. Independence is an opportunity to remove those fences, to destroy those barriers, to create a more communal approach to living to society. Fences and barriers and boundaries of all sorts are a motif that I encounter in both Brexit and independence literature, but the specifics of their deployment certainly shift. So, Ali Smith's third book in her seasonal quartet, Spring, is perhaps of most interest to me today, because it takes on another interesting perspective on borders, and it explicitly spends its time in Scotland. We meet Richard on page 11, standing on a train platform in North Scotland. We also follow Britt Hall, a woman who's newly employed at an immigration detention centre. Though a 12-year-old girl named Florence seems to sort of flout the rules of the centre, she's able to talk her way out of locked rooms, demand and receive cleaning services, disrupt the smooth running order of the detention centre. Eventually, she and Britt undertake their own journey to Scotland, and as they cross out of England into Scotland, Britt raises the potential for there to be a formal passport-requiring border there in the future, hinting at Scottish independence. The importance of the border is, however, ultimately undermined, here as Dennis Hannibal argues. But the perspective that Florence voices immediately after reframes how we might think of borders in general. Rather than as a separation, Florence encouraged us to think of borders as a meeting space. She reframes the negative associations. Britt obviously immediately dismisses this as incredibly naive, and Florence said, of course it's naive, I'm 12. But children, as these sort of universally potent symbols of the future, in her optimism suggests that any border between England and Scotland in the future need not be a frightening prospect, but instead one that creates doubleness, something that I think we're all very fond of seeing in Scottish literature. So even the characters' names in Ali Smith's work, in true Ali Smith style, are worth paying attention to in this context. Our two key players are called Brittany and Florence, well-known spaces within Europe, but when we break them down to their nicknames, they do something different. Brittany becomes a representation of Britain more generally. Her colleagues literally call her Britannia in places. Her work, her cultural position, her choices request that you consider her as a representation of nation, and particularly of a nation that voted for Brexit. Florence, on the other hand, becomes flow, suggesting fluidity and movement. Her ability to move through otherwise heavily policed areas certainly fits in with this, and her sense of comfort in transgressing perceived boundaries. Her flowiness is in direct opposition to this punitive Brit-ishness, this perspective on borders that Brit represents for us. Borders in general in Ali Smith's fiction are constantly being renegotiated and altered or vanished. Here, this is an excerpt from just before the previous one I showed you, where potentially climate and change-induced erosion of the coastline is shared in the exact same passage as the installation of a new man-made fence that we're worried about. Hedges are a vital component in spring, and in autumn we begin on a beach, that kind of marker between land and sea. And in general, these spaces are all in flux. Smith shows us that these are alterable, they're negotiable, for better or for worse. Concerns around national distinctions recur in spring, as Smith details how Scottish identity and space conflict in a post-Brexit Britain. One of Brit's colleagues, who is importantly noted to be Scottish, is observed to have a different approach to the detainees in the centre that is more empathetic. His position is more suspicious of the work that he does and cautious not to be poisoned by that kind of work in his own personality, his own soul. Scottishness in this way is connected with a resistance to anti-immigration policies in a very sort of simplified representation of the Brexit vote distinctions we saw. The network that helps immigration-centred detainees escape and live lives outside of those centres is called the Old Alliance in the book, and it is one of their vehicles that we see crossing the border so freely earlier in the novel. I hate to say ultimately that the novel is not optimistic about the differences in cultures post-Brexit, post-IndyRef, but one of its final images takes place at the old battlefield at Culloden, where a child and a young woman are abducted by a small mob of people in uniform, while costume actors from the visitor centre look on. Reenactors from the battle that Richard in the novel earlier characterised as being the last battle of the English against the Scots, they look on. So in this final image, we kind of have Smith connecting a sense of history, national mythology, with contemporary British resultant immigration policies. The violence of both those scenes sits very uncomfortably, but the sense of conflict, as Richard describes it, between the English and the Scots lingers. There's a conflict somewhere in there. Ultimately, I believe that there's something worthwhile in considering Brexit and IndyRef literature in parallel. As political events, these referendums are connected. Their proximity in time means they speak to a similar cultural moment, and they have, as I've pointed out, similar motifs like fences, which attest to some shared concerns. I ask, if Brexit has been a concept so readily embraced, why is there still so much suspicion about using the independence referendum as a literary marker? Is it solely because Brexit was successful in its goals that the resultant change from that referendum has demanded the literary attention? Or is the culture that required the vote in the first place perhaps enough to warrant fictional representation and exploration? Ariane Antrona suggests that the relative absence of Brexit fiction from Scottish writers is because we can't speak meaningfully about one national debate when another demands our focus. But writers like Ali Smith, who occupy that interesting territory with nationality, perhaps are permitted more freedom to explore these intersections in a way that dyed-in-the-wool Scottish writers might not be. This has, of course, been a 10-minute contemplation and therefore a little whirlwind, but I do hope you read all the Ali Smith you can get your hands on. So thank you hugely for your time and attention. It's greatly appreciated. But I realised I've just deleted my bibliography slides. So if you want to know what I've cited, I'll email it to you. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. That's brilliant. We've got just over a quarter of an hour that we can use to ask questions of our speakers, or just throw some questions out to whoever would like to contribute. So again, please raise your hand or put something in the chat, or use the Q&A function. I think that's a thing. I'm not quite sure how it works, but we will figure it out. I should remind you actually that we are recording the whole session today, so the papers will be available. If that is a problem for anyone in terms of sharing questions or anything, let me know. We don't have to keep recording. Yes, Ariana.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, great. Yeah, first of all, thanks so much, all of you, for 3 amazing papers. I was totally blown away by all of them. Thank you so much. I have a question for each of you, and please feel free just to ignore my question if it's not very relevant. Maybe there are other questions. I'm sure there are other people. So I think for Maike and Calum, my question, and also Gina, but for you, I have other questions. So, but yeah, for all of you, but especially Maike and Calum, I was wondering, but Gina as well. So all of you, Gina, please feel free to pick the questions for you. What do you, thanks so much for your discussion of IndyRef literature and all of you three, all of you, all three of you. I was wondering what you think about the idea of a post-IndyRef literature. In terms, is it a usable concept in light of what you have been analyzing as far as IndyRef literature is concerned? So your thoughts about this question. And for Gina, that question I think is of interest to me, and also in terms of, I think that would apply to Brexit literature. Is there anything as, I don't know, post-Brexit in terms of that specific moment that you analyze with Alice Smith? But for you, Gina, my question, something I was really wondering about, is about borders more generally in Alice Smith's fiction. And I'm really in love with Alice Smith's latest book, Glyph. So I'm particularly interested in what you, in borders, if you, what you think about borders, if there is a difference in the ways in which Alice Smith imagines and writes about borders in her Brexit compared to the ways in which Smith writes about borders generally, but also after that moment of Brexit literature. So just feel free to answer whichever part of the question. I'm wondering about borders, if they are different in in Alice Smith's Brexit literature. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Ariana. And any of our speakers want to chime in, please do. You look ready to go, Gina.
I feel like because it was the most recent. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead and skipping the queue. Yeah, absolutely. I think what's so exciting about so much of Ali Smith's work is that we're interested in transformations and liminal stages, like people becoming trees or occupying third genders and playing around with binarism. Boundaries as occupying a sort of space between two binaries offer something I think that really sits comfortably with a lot of the themes she approaches in most of her writing. I think the project of Seasonal Quartet, where she had already decided, right, I will write about the cultural moment, we'll do it really quickly, to then be confronted with Brexit, I think was just kismet. I think it just worked really well in terms of something that was pre-existing in her body of work to then just make sense with something she was interested in. So I think she got lucky, maybe. Is that a bad thing to say? But I think it works really well. And I'll be quiet now. Sorry, someone else will go.
Lovely, thanks, Gina. Calum, Maike, do you want to speak to Ariana's question about periodization and how useful these terms are?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think a really difficult one as well, because, and I tried to sort of like touch upon this a little bit in my reflection, but I think there's not sure if Scottish literature as a whole has changed, partly because so little has changed in terms of the referendum itself, right? We didn't see a political change, but also so many of the hopes and dreams connected to the referendum and how that might impact society haven't really come into effect. And I think that's something that we can see or say now, 10 years after the referendum. Surprisingly little has changed. There's always a question of of how much would change if the referendum would have been successful. But and I think in terms of literature, some of that has affected literature as well. And I thought the notion that Calum you brought up about sort of like an unfinished moment in time speaks to that, where this sort of like moment lingers on. There hasn't been a radical change, but in connection to that moment, we're still not quite sure where things are going. So where literature is connected to the referendum, I think there are some interesting product literary like reflections that directly connect it. But I would say there's also a lot of literature that never really connected to it and also hasn't been affected by it. So yeah, it's not really a response, but more maybe indicating various directions that are connected or not connected to IndyRef literature. And I would say it has, where literature made a connection to the referendum, it has had an effect, but where it didn't, it maybe hasn't. I don't know if that's helpful at all. Sorry.
Grand, thank you very much, Maike. Do you want to contribute, Calum, to this question?
Yeah, all I'd really add is that I think part of the reason why it's maybe hard to say if we're in a sort of post-IndyRef moment in Scottish culture and society and in literature is kind of because we're post so much, you know, that we're post IndyRef, post Brexit, post Trump, post Corbyn, post COVID, post Tory. There's this, like Scotland. If Scotland existed in its own wee silo that sometimes it feels like we almost imagine it does, then perhaps it would be more concerning that there isn't this specific feeling that we are in the aftermath of IndyRef. But I think because we do exist in connection with all these other UK level and then global events means that it almost gets, and I think that the Brexit stuff is so interesting because in like British society especially, it all gets swept away with Brexit. I think that not so much in Scotland, but in the UK in general, IndyRef is kind of imagined more in or understood more in the way as the referendum on voting that happened in, was it 2011, as a kind of forgotten referendum when all the focus is on Brexit and then all the other myriad things that have happened. So I think that also kind of muddies the waters of it a wee bit.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yeah, any other questions? Please raise your hand or jump into the chat. Or Kelly.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the three speakers and also to the organizing team. That was really a pleasure to listen to. Thank you so much. I have a question on journeys in IndyRef Lit, and the question was sparked with Maike's first presentation, and then Gina, you also mentioned journeys, but also Calum, if you have a response to this question, please. And it's about, does journeying through the Scottish landscape play a role in the idea of Scottishness and being Scotland in IndyRef Lit? And if so, what role does it play? Have you seen that at all? Have you observed it? Of Maike, of the three novels you mentioned, I've only read To Be Continued, and I think that's pretty clear because the main character travels through the Highlands, but in other works or in other examples, do you see that at all?
Yeah, thank you. A great question. I have sort of like a love-hate relationship, as you might have picked up from my comment, with this sort of like journey to yes or no, and some of that comes through in these novels, and you're right, and To Be Continued is quite prominent. Similarly in Cynico, it's a similar thing where Cynico is a reporter or writing for an Italian newspaper and is traveling Scotland to find the IndyRef story, and he sort of like moves around places. it's maybe less scenic than To Be Continued, which is quite sort of like focused on these tropes of the Highlands and the hills and the people and things like that. But there's also this journey, and I think in both novels, it's used also as sort of like a metaphorical journey to oneself for both characters. They're sort of like experiencing through meeting people, through like connecting with the land, in this slightly romantic image that's also broken. They're sort of like finding themselves in different ways as well. In the Mile, there's also a very short journey, which is literally down the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. So it's basically a pub crawl along that Royal Mile, so the journey is 1 mile long. But they also it has this element of moving from one place to another and sort of like moving the discussion along while you physically move and connecting with new arguments. So that's there as well. And I would say even in Scabby Queen, there's a lot of like journeying from Kirsten Innes, Cleo Campbell, who's lives in London, but sort of like through testimonies and newspapers and things like that, we also hear about her journeys back and forth between London and Scotland and different parts of Scotland and the Highlands, that again play quite a big role also as an image of maybe sort of like, if you think back to sort of like these romanticized ideas of the Scottish journeys that you might know from sort of like Walter Scott and things like that. And I think there are elements that are also recurring in that space.
Thank you, Maike. Calum, Gina, you guys want to?
Yeah, I can't speak on it as well, but even just in the Mile, that idea of movement from castle to Holyrood, like literally a castle to a parliament, is such an interesting choice. I think what I tend to see, or at least notice and pay attention to the most, is usually when I see a journey, it is moving northwards. It's interested in pulling away from a border and into a more authentic or traditional Scottishness and a more magical landscape, more fit for transformation. I think there's something very interesting about how movement works, exactly as you're saying already. But I'm particularly interested in what direction that journey is taking. I tend to see, if you're engaged in Scottishness, you're going up.
Thank you. Calum? Or do I have to?
No, I think that's very well answered.
Oh, Grant. Okay. Well, we're nearly out of time. If anyone has a question, please jump in. I've got a million questions, but sorry, Maike. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may.
Please.
I have a question for Gina as well. Because yeah, thank you also for your and Calum for your presentation. I was wondering, because you're talking about Brit as a character who's standing in for the nation, and obviously there's quite a lot of connections to what I mentioned in terms of like especially sort of like female figures standing in as representatives for and of the nation. And yeah, I was just wondering if you can say a little bit more about how you think that works within in that context, and why you think maybe there's ruptures, or yeah, why it works well.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a disappointing conclusion in terms of Brit's journey through Scotland. It ultimately doesn't help. She concludes the novel, sorry if anyone's going to read it. She concludes the novel by basically removing herself from the shifts that she has with her more empathetic Scottish co-worker, doubling down, and things don't work out for the people that she's supposed to have been building empathy with. And I think it's a really interesting narrative arc that Smith chooses for us there, instead of a very simplistic, oh, all I needed was an interaction in order to change who I am. I think it feels quite representative of the British public in terms of refusing to learn a lesson or to connect with other people at a human level. I think we see that in our voting records. We do not learn quickly. So I think that there's something really interesting. I don't think it's subtle necessarily, her idea of representing Britishness. I think it's maybe heavy-handed in some ways, but it really gets this message across in an effective way. But yes, her colleagues calling her Britannia really strips you of any doubt that she's supposed to be standing in for a representation of her demographic, the British public at her age. It's worth a read. Try the whole quartet, try Glyph, do it all.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Gina. I mean, if we had time, I'd really love to dig into the question of like temporalities as well. It came up in all three papers. And Maike, you really, you mentioned this, the sort of refrain about the referendum being a once in a lifetime thing. And that really, I'd sort of forgotten about that framing, and it plugs into all of these texts that you guys have been looking at so well. This idea about how do you reconcile this singular moment with the idea of a life course, right? Of a single life. And so many of these writers play with those things, and some reach a little bit further back into history, and Smith especially is interested in what's just beyond kind of living memory, right into the mid and early part of the 20th century. Other writers, it's entirely about the singular moment or the political journey, as we've been talking about, of one character over one lifetime in terms of their understandings of their past and their projections about the future, what have you. But I think it's the most interesting texts seem to be where lots of different scales of temporalities, whether it comes down to the knight and the count, right through to, you know, a reenactor ghost of the Battle of Culloden, overseeing the detention of migrants, or some of the wacky futuristic and deep historical speculations of the Book of Scotland, for instance, right? When these things start to fold up on top of one another, you start to realize that, like, oh, this speaks back to that comment that you shared, I think, Maike, about a writer saying, like, it's hard to be creative about this. What is it? Thistles and stuff. And then this idea that there's a long literary tradition, not least one full of journeys and travel writing in Scottish literary culture, right? That has traipsed this path thousands of times before. And yet, even one of our writers, when confronted with their right, what are we going to do about Scotland and independence and a referendum? And you're like, what, thistles and stuff, you know, that there's always a singular journey for each contributor to these kinds of discourses to go on, you know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in and talking too much, but I'll stop recording and